Something was stealing from her. Not a person, not a ghost, but something swift, silent, and unseen. Until tonight. The city was alive with its usual hum, a chorus of distant car horns, muffled conversations, and the rhythmic footsteps of night wanderers. But inside Linda's apartment, nestled in a quieter part of the bustling streets, an unsettling stillness lingered. Something was off. She first noticed it a few nights ago, small things disappearing from her kitchen. At first, it was just scraps. A piece of chicken left out too long, a slice of bread she swore she hadn't eaten. But then, entire portions of food started vanishing. A full bowl of leftover stew, a half-eaten sandwich, gone without a trace. Linda wasn't forgetful, nor was she careless. Someone, or something, had been sneaking into her home. Determined to catch the culprit, she devised a simple plan. That night, she left a plate of grilled fish on the counter and turned off the lights, retreating to the hallway where she had a clear view of the kitchen. A single lamp cast a dim glow, enough to illuminate any movement. She sat in silence, heart pounding, and the weight of anticipation pressing down on her. Minutes passed, then an hour. Just as she began to question herself, a shadow flickered at the edge of her vision. A small, nimble figure slinked into the kitchen, moving with practiced ease. A cat. Linda's breath caught as the stray crept onto the counter, its sleek black fur blending into the night. It had a lean frame, battle-worn from life on the streets, but its golden eyes gleamed with intelligence. The cat sniffed the air, then cautiously reached out, swiping the fish off the plate in one swift motion. She had expected a simple act of theft, a desperate animal scavenging for survival, but something in its demeanor felt deliberate, almost knowing. It didn't just eat hurriedly and flee. Instead, it paused, ears twitching, as if sensing her presence. Then, to Linda's astonishment, the cat turned its head and locked eyes with her. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the cat snatched the fish in its mouth and bolted toward the open window, disappearing into the night. Linda rushed to the window, peering down into the alley below. The cat was already weaving through the shadows, vanishing into the maze of the city. Her heart pounded. This wasn't just any stray. There was something different about this cat, something she couldn't quite explain. And she was going to find out what. The next morning, Linda woke with one thought lingering in her mind. The cat. She had barely slept, replaying the moment those golden eyes met hers, searching for meaning in the silent exchange. Who was he? And why did she feel like he wasn't just another stray? With a steaming mug of coffee in her hands, she sat by the kitchen window, gazing out into the alley below. The city was already awake. Delivery trucks rumbled down the street, early risers hurried off to work, and pigeons flitted between the rooftops. But there was no sign of him. She told herself to let it go. It was just a cat, a hungry, clever little thief who had found a convenient food source. But something about it gnawed at her. She had lived in this apartment for years, and no other stray had ever dared sneak inside like that. Pushing aside her thoughts, she went about her morning routine. She swept the floors, watered the plants, and distracted herself with work emails. But as the afternoon stretched on, a familiar itch returned. Curiosity. By evening, she had made up her mind. If the cat had come once, he would come again. And this time, she would be ready. She prepared another plate of fish, just like before, but this time she left the kitchen door slightly ajar, leading to the balcony. If he had a way in, she wanted to know how. Then she turned off the lights and took her place in the hallway once more. Minutes turned to hours. The city's hum faded into the quiet of the night. And then, a faint rustling. Her breath hitched as she watched the shadows near the balcony door shift. A sleek black figure emerged, moving with careful precision. The cat. But he didn't just creep inside. He hesitated, his ears twitching as if he sensed something watching him. His movements weren't those of a mindless scavenger. There was calculation in the way he scanned the room, an eerie level of awareness. It was as if he knew this was a trap, yet chose to walk into it anyway. Linda remained frozen, her pulse drumming in her ears. The cat moved cautiously, his paws barely making a sound on the wooden floor. He inched closer to the plate of fish, sniffed the air, then stopped. His golden eyes flickered toward the hallway, locking directly onto hers. A shiver ran down Linda's spine. He had known she was there the entire time. Slowly, deliberately, the cat took a step forward, straight toward her. Linda's breath caught. The logical part of her brain screamed at her to move, to make a sound, to do something. But she couldn't. The sheer intensity of the cat's gaze held her in place. Step by step, he closed the distance between them. His tail flicked, his posture confident, like he was testing her rather than the other way around. Then, just as he was close enough to touch, he did something she hadn't expected. He sat down, right in front of her. Linda's chest rose and fell in uneven breaths. Was he surrendering? Communicating? Waiting? The seconds stretched, thick with something unspoken. Then, before she could make a move, the cat let out a single, low sound. Not a meow, not a growl, something else entirely. Something that sounded almost human. The sound lingered in the air, a deep, resonant noise that sent a chill up Linda's spine. Her fingers twitched at her sides, resisting the instinct to recoil. The cat, Leo, she decided in that moment, continued to watch her, unblinking, as if he were waiting for something. Linda swallowed, steadying herself. "All right," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're not an ordinary stray, but what are you?" Leo flicked his tail, his golden eyes glinting under the dim kitchen light. Then, as if he had made up his mind, he rose to his feet and did something unexpected. He nudged the plate of fish with his paw, pushing it slightly toward her before taking a small step back. Linda frowned. Was he sharing? Testing her? It was absurd, but something about the gesture made her hesitate. Slowly, she crouched down, bringing herself to his level, her gaze locked onto his. "Are we negotiating now?" she asked, half amused, half wary. Leo didn't answer, of course. But the moment she reached out and slid the plate back toward him, he purred. A deep, rich sound that sent another ripple of unease through her. He lowered his head and began to eat, but not before casting her another glance, as if to say, "I accept." Linda exhaled. Whatever this was, it was just the beginning. The moment stretched between them, silent, thick with something unspoken. Linda held her breath as Leo remained seated before her, his golden eyes gleaming with eerie intelligence. The soft hum of the city outside barely reached them. It was as if they existed in their own little world now, cut off from time. Leo flicked his tail, his gaze unwavering. He was studying her, just as she was studying him. Hesitantly, Linda shifted, her hand resting on the floor between them. It was a small, deliberate gesture, an offering of peace. She expected him to flinch, to back away, but he didn't. Instead, he leaned forward ever so slightly, his whiskers twitching as he sniffed the air between them. "You really are something else," Linda whispered, her voice softer than she intended. Leo didn't react immediately, but then, in a movement so subtle she almost missed it, he reached out a paw and placed it just inches from her hand. Not touching, not quite trusting yet, but close. Linda's heart skipped. For the next few minutes, they simply sat there, neither moving, neither speaking. It was a fragile moment, delicate, as though any sudden movement would break whatever fragile thread was binding them together. Then, without warning, Leo turned and padded away, not toward the door, but further into her apartment. Linda blinked. "Hey, wait, where are you going?" Leo ignored her, his movements casual, as if he had lived there his entire life. He sniffed the air, weaving between her furniture, brushing past the coffee table before leaping onto the couch with a grace that made it look effortless. Linda remained on the floor, watching in astonishment. "He's making himself at home." She exhaled, rubbing her temple. "Well, that's just great." Leo stretched out on the couch, his golden eyes meeting hers once more. If she didn't know any better, she'd think he was smirking. Linda let out a soft chuckle. "Looks like I have a guest." And for some reason, she didn't mind at all. The next morning, Linda woke to an unusual sensation, warmth at her feet. For a split second, her sleepy mind struggled to process it, until she lifted the blanket and found Leo curled up at the end of the bed, his tail twitching lazily. She let out a slow breath, half in amusement and half in disbelief. "You're getting comfortable, aren't you?" she murmured. Leo flicked one ear but didn't move. If anything, he seemed even more settled, as if her voice was simply a lullaby, soothing him further into sleep. Linda ran a hand through her hair and sat up, stretching. The events of the past 2 days felt surreal. A stray cat breaking into her home, staring at her with unsettling intelligence, and now acting like he belonged here. She carefully slid out of bed, trying not to disturb him. In the kitchen, she brewed herself a cup of coffee, the scent filling the small apartment. She was halfway through her first sip when she felt eyes on her. Turning, she saw Leo perched on the counter, watching her. "You're a quiet one, aren't you?" she said, arching an eyebrow. Leo didn't respond, but the way he sat, poised, observing, almost patient, made her feel like she was being studied rather than the other way around. Linda sighed, rubbing her forehead. "All right, I'll bite. You're here now, so let's figure out what to do with you." Leo tilted his head slightly, his golden eyes gleaming. Shaking her head, she grabbed a can of tuna from the cupboard, popping it open and setting it down on the floor. He didn't hesitate this time. He hopped down with graceful ease and began eating, though with the same dignified manner that set him apart from other strays she had encountered. Linda leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "So, do you have an owner? Are you lost?" She knew she wouldn't get an answer, but still, she felt compelled to ask. Leo paused, lifting his head slightly, then resumed eating. Linda frowned. Was she imagining things, or had he actually considered her question? After he finished his meal, Leo didn't dart toward the door like most strays would. Instead, he leapt back onto the counter and began grooming himself, perfectly at ease. Linda sighed. "I guess you're staying a little longer." She glanced at the clock. It was nearly noon. She had errands to run, but a strange hesitation settled in her chest. What if Leo left while she was gone? And why did that thought bother her so much? She shook her head. "He's a stray, Linda. He'll do what he wants." But an idea formed in her mind. If Leo was still here when she got back, then maybe, just maybe, this wasn't just some fleeting encounter. Maybe it was the beginning of something more. Linda spent the rest of the afternoon running errands, but her mind never fully left her apartment. She had expected Leo to vanish while she was out, to slip away like a whisper in the night, leaving only the faint memory of golden eyes and soft footfalls. But as she turned the key in the lock and pushed open the door, there he was, perched on the armrest of the couch, his tail flicking lazily, as if he had been waiting for her all along. Linda let out a small laugh, shaking her head. "You really are something else." Leo blinked slowly, unbothered by her presence, as if he had already decided this was home. Setting her bags down, She moved into the kitchen and unpacked the groceries, her thoughts swirling. Every logical part of her told her to let him go. He was a stray, a wild thing meant for the streets, but something deeper, something unspoken, whispered that he was more than that. She poured herself a cup of tea and hesitated before reaching for a second saucer. It felt ridiculous, yet she placed it on the floor, filling it with a small amount of milk. Leo's ears twitched at the sound, and within seconds, he was by her side, lapping it up with practiced ease. "You need a name," Linda mused aloud, watching him. "I can't keep calling you Cat forever." Leo paused mid-lick, his eyes flickering up to meet hers. "Leo," she said, testing the name on her tongue. Strong, mysterious. For the first time, something in Leo's expression shifted. He straightened, his ears perking slightly, as if he recognized the name. Linda's breath caught. That wasn't a coincidence. She felt it. Her fingers tingled as she reached out, hesitating only for a moment before brushing her fingertips gently over his head. To her surprise, he leaned into the touch, his purring a deep, almost rhythmic sound that vibrated through her skin. Something about it felt old, as if this wasn't the first time they had met, as if she had whispered that name before, in another life, in another moment. Linda's chest tightened. "Who are you, Leo?" The cat said nothing, only continued to purr, but his golden eyes held 1,000 answers she wasn't ready to hear yet. And just like that, the fragile thread between them strengthened. She didn't know what she was getting herself into, but one thing was clear. Leo wasn't leaving, and she wasn't letting him go. Linda woke in the middle of the night to a strange sound, soft, rhythmic breathing, just inches from her face. Her heart jumped, instinct screaming at her that she wasn't alone. Her fingers fumbled for the bedside lamp, and as warm light flooded the room, she found herself staring directly into a pair of glowing golden eyes. Leo was perched on the nightstand, utterly still. He wasn't startled by the sudden light, nor did he flinch at her movement. Instead, he simply gazed at her, his pupils dilated, his expression unreadable. Linda pressed a hand against her chest, trying to calm the racing of her heart. "You scared me," she whispered, her voice hoarse from sleep. Leo didn't move, but then, after a long moment, he let out a sound, a soft, almost melodic hum deep in his throat. It wasn't a typical meow or purr. It was something else entirely, something that made the hairs on her arms rise. A whisper in the dark. A shiver ran through her, but it wasn't from fear. It was something deeper, something that stirred in the very core of her being. Leo blinked once, slow and deliberate, then gracefully leapt from the nightstand onto the bed. He didn't curl up at her feet like a normal cat might. Instead, he settled beside her, watching her with an intensity that made her feel as if she was being weighed, measured, understood. Linda swallowed. "What are you, Leo?" The cat didn't answer, of course, but in that moment, she felt certain that he could, if only she knew how to listen. She reached out, hesitating for only a fraction of a second before running her fingers through his fur. He was warm, solid, real. And yet, something about him still felt just beyond her grasp, like a dream she couldn't quite remember. Leo leaned into her touch, his deep purr vibrating through her fingers, soothing and mesmerizing at the same time. Linda exhaled slowly, allowing herself to relax. Maybe she was imagining things. Maybe she was just tired. But as her breathing steadied and sleep began to claim her once more, she thought she heard something. A whisper. So faint, she wasn't sure if it was real or just the edge of a dream. A voice, distant and familiar. Linda. Her eyes snapped open, her breath catching in her throat. Leo was still beside her, his eyes closed, his breathing deep and even. Had she imagined it? Her pulse pounded in her ears as she scanned the room, half expecting someone to be standing there in the shadows. But there was nothing. Just the dim glow of the lamp, the soft rise and fall of Leo's chest. Linda's fingers curled into the bedsheet. Something was happening. Something she didn't understand. And it had started the moment Leo walked into her life. She reached over and switched off the lamp, plunging the room into darkness once more. But as she drifted back to sleep, one thought remained, circling in her mind like a ghost that refused to be ignored. She had heard her name. The morning sunlight streamed through the curtains, warming the wooden floor of Linda's apartment. She stretched, feeling the stiffness in her limbs from another restless night. Her mind was still trapped in the echo of the voice she had heard. Her name, whispered as if from the depths of time itself. Leo sat on the windowsill, staring out into the city as if he belonged to it, yet was forever apart from it. His tail swayed in a slow rhythm, and Linda had the distinct feeling that he was waiting for something, or someone. With a sigh, she swung her legs over the bed and padded into the kitchen. She moved on autopilot, setting the kettle to boil and reaching for her favorite mug. But as she turned, her gaze landed on something peculiar. A small stack of old letters and photographs, haphazardly left on the dining table. She frowned. She didn't remember leaving them there. In fact, she hadn't gone through that box of keepsakes in years. She picked up the top photograph, a faded black and white picture of her as a child, sitting on the steps of her childhood home. Her fingers traced the edges, memories flickering like embers in her mind. The summer heat, the scent of freshly cut grass, the distant laughter of her mother calling her inside. And then, her breath hitched. In the corner of the photo, almost out of frame, sat a black cat, golden eyes staring directly at the camera. Linda's fingers trembled as she brought the photograph closer. It couldn't be. It was just a coincidence, just a random stray that had wandered into the shot that day. But the resemblance was uncanny. Heart pounding, she rifled through the rest of the stack, searching for more. And then she found it. Another picture, this time from her teenage years. She was sitting on the porch with her father, smiling at the camera. And there, at her feet, the same black cat, the same golden eyes. A chill crept up her spine. This wasn't possible. That cat, whoever it had been, would be long gone by now. Decades had passed. And yet, she turned her head slowly, eyes landing on Leo. He was still by the window, still watching the city. But then, as if sensing her gaze, he turned his head ever so slightly. Their eyes met, and Linda knew. This wasn't a coincidence. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to speak. "Leo, have we met before?" The cat didn't move at first, but then, in that slow, deliberate way of his, he blinked once, a deep, knowing blink. Linda felt the air shift around her, as if the very fabric of reality had wavered. A memory stirred, half-formed, just beyond reach. A voice, warm and familiar. "You'll see me again one day." She stumbled back, the photograph slipping from her fingers. Her mind was spinning, her breath coming in short gasps. None of this made sense, and yet she couldn't deny the truth staring her in the face. Leo wasn't just a stray. He had always been there, watching, waiting. And now he had come back. Linda pressed a hand to her chest, struggling to steady herself. Whatever this was, whatever he was, it was bigger than anything she had ever known, and she wasn't sure she was ready for the answers.
Linda sat on the couch, the forgotten photograph still lying on the floor beside her. Her fingers trembled as she traced the curve of her own childhood face in the image. The cat, no, Leo, had been there. Not just recently. Not just in this lifetime. He had always been there. The weight of realization pressed down on her, making it difficult to breathe. She turned to Leo, who was still seated on the windowsill, staring out into the world as though he had all the answers she lacked. His tail flicked absently, his golden eyes reflecting the soft glow of the morning light. "Tell me the truth," she whispered. "Are you the same cat?" Her half-expected silence. Half-expected nothing. But Leo turned to face her, blinking with slow deliberation. It was almost as if he were saying yes. Her mind spun with possibilities. Had he been following her? Watching over her? Was this coincidence, or something more? The logical part of her brain screamed that she was overthinking things. Cats didn't live that long. They didn't appear in old photographs spanning decades. They didn't return, unchanged, as if time had no claim over them. And yet, Linda bent down and picked up the photograph. She needed answers. She needed proof that she wasn't losing her mind. Rising from the couch, she strode across the room and grabbed her laptop. Within moments, she was scanning the image, zooming in on the cat's face. She flipped through other old pictures, searching for a pattern she hadn't noticed before. And there it was, again and again. A shadow in the background. A black-furred figure in the distance. Always watching. Always near. She sucked in a breath, her pulse thundering. This was impossible. Leo jumped from the windowsill and padded toward her, his movements slow, deliberate. He hopped onto the desk, his tail curling around her arm as he looked up at her with those knowing golden eyes. A memory surfaced, one she hadn't thought about in years. A stormy night when she was a little girl. The power had gone out, and she'd been terrified. She had huddled under the blankets, too afraid to move, when something warm curled up beside her. She had never questioned it then, never turned to look. But she had felt comforted. Safe. Had it been him? Tears burned in her eyes. "Leo," she murmured, stroking his fur. "Who are you really?" Leo purred, a deep, reverberating sound that filled the quiet room. It wasn't just a noise, it was a presence, a feeling, a whisper of something ancient and unspoken. Linda's breath hitched as another thought struck her. What if Leo wasn't just a cat? What if he had been something more, someone more, in another time? She wasn't sure if she was ready for the truth. But she knew one thing. Leo had come back to her for a reason. And she was going to find out why. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Linda lay awake, her thoughts tangled in the impossible reality before her. Leo wasn't just a stray. He was a constant, a presence that had somehow lingered in her life for decades, maybe even longer. She needed answers, and she knew exactly where to start. The next morning, with determination burning in her chest, she found herself outside the old city library. It had been years since she last stepped foot inside, but she remembered the way the scent of aging paper and ink had once comforted her. Maybe now, those pages held the truth she desperately sought. Leo, as expected, had followed her. He padded silently by her side, his golden eyes scanning their surroundings as if sensing an invisible thread pulling them forward. Linda hesitated at the entrance, glancing down at him. "I don't suppose you know what we're looking for, do you?" Leo only blinked, his expression unreadable. Taking a deep breath, Linda pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stepped inside. The library was nearly empty, save for an older woman behind the front desk. She peered at Linda over the rim of her reading glasses, offering a polite nod. "Good morning. Can I help you find something?" Linda hesitated, debating how much she should say. I'm looking for historical records. Old newspapers, maybe something about the city's early days." The woman tilted her head. "Anything in particular?" Linda swallowed. "Stray cats," she admitted. "Or, stories about unusual sightings, unexplained occurrences." The librarian gave her a curious look but didn't press further. "That would be in the archives downstairs. Follow me." As Linda trailed behind the woman, Leo stayed close to her heels, moving with an eerie sense of purpose. The library's lower level was dimly lit, the scent of dust and time clinging to the air. The librarian gestured toward the rows of cabinets filled with microfilm and old documents. "You might find something in here," she said. "Take your time." Linda nodded in thanks before turning to the cabinets. She ran her fingers over the labeled drawers, searching for something, anything, that could explain Leo's presence in her life. An hour passed before she found it. A newspaper clipping from nearly a century ago. Her heart pounded as she read the faded text. "Mysterious black cat appears across generations, a guardian of the forgotten." Her fingers tightened around the fragile paper. The article described accounts of a black cat seen throughout the city, always near moments of great change, war, tragedy, rebirth. The descriptions matched Leo exactly, down to his piercing golden eyes. She turned to look at him. He sat beside her, watching, waiting. It wasn't a coincidence. It never had been. Linda exhaled shakily. "You've been here all along, haven't you?" Leo blinked once, slow and deliberate. The air in the room felt heavier now, charged with something unsaid. She didn't know how, or why, but one thing was certain, Leo was more than a stray. More than a memory. He was a guardian of something lost. And now, she was about to uncover what that meant. Linda sat in the dimly lit library basement, her fingers trembling as they hovered over the old newspaper clipping. The faded ink told a story too strange to believe, a black cat, appearing through the ages, tied to moments of loss, change, and rebirth. Every instinct in her mind screamed that this was impossible. And yet, Leo sat beside her, his golden eyes reflecting the low light, calm as ever. As if he had been waiting for her to discover this all along. Linda swallowed hard. "Who are you?" she whispered. Leo blinked once. Then, slowly, he rose to his feet and padded toward the far end of the room. At first, she thought he was merely wandering, but then he stopped in front of an old wooden chest tucked in the shadows. Something about it sent a shiver down her spine. She stood, hesitantly stepping toward it, her pulse hammering against her ribs. The chest was covered in dust, the wood aged and worn. She reached out, brushing her fingers across its surface. A name was carved into the lid. Eleanor Montgomery. Linda's breath hitched. That name, she knew it. Her grandmother. She fell back a step, her head spinning. How was this possible? What was her grandmother's name doing here, in the forgotten depths of the city library? Leo let out a low, almost urging sound. Trembling, Linda crouched down and unlatched the chest. The hinges creaked in protest as she lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in aged fabric, were letters. Dozens of them. Carefully preserved and tied together with ribbon. She picked up the first one, her fingers shaking as she unfolded the delicate paper. The handwriting was unmistakable, her grandmother's flowing script. "My dearest Eleanor," the letter began. "By the time you read this, I will be long gone. But I need you to know the truth." Linda's vision blurred with tears. She flipped through the letters, her hands moving faster now. Words jumped out at her, mentions of a guardian, a promise, a secret passed through generations. Leo brushed against her arm, grounding her. She turned to him, something deep and unspoken settling in her chest. He wasn't just a stray. He was a guardian. A protector tied to her family's past, to secrets buried beneath time and memory. Her entire world had just changed. And she needed to know the rest. With renewed determination, she grabbed the letters and clutched them to her chest. She had spent her whole life looking forward, never questioning the past. Now, she was ready to face it. Linda sat on the worn wooden floor of the library basement, surrounded by the letters that had been hidden away for generations. The weight of their significance pressed down on her as she carefully unfolded another fragile sheet. The ink had faded with time, but the words still carried undeniable meaning. You will never be alone, Eleanor. He will always find you. Linda's breath hitched as she reread the sentence, her fingers tightening on the paper. The he in question could only mean one thing, Leo. Or whatever he truly was. Her grandmother had known. She glanced at Leo, who sat patiently beside her, his golden eyes unwavering. He had stopped pretending to be just a cat. There was something ancient in his gaze, something that knew far more than he let on. Linda's hands trembled as she reached for another letter. This one was dated nearly 100 years ago. When the world shifts and the past tries to disappear, he remains. A protector of what is forgotten, a keeper of stories lost to time. Her heart pounded. She flipped through more pages, her pulse quickening with each passing word. Every letter told a similar story. Each woman in her family had, at some point in her life, been watched over by this same black cat. Leo had been there. Through generations. Through lifetimes. Linda's throat tightened. You've been protecting us, she whispered, staring at Leo in disbelief. But from what? Leo didn't move at first. But then, slowly, he stood and padded toward her, his tail curling around her wrist. A silent reassurance. Something inside her clicked. A memory, half-formed, just beyond her grasp. She had always felt a presence watching over her as a child, especially on the nights when she had been scared or lonely. She had thought it was just her imagination. But it had been him. It had always been him. Tears welled in her eyes. Why me? She asked, voice barely above a whisper. Leo blinked slowly, then let out a deep, rumbling purr. It wasn't just a sound, it was a feeling, an answer without words. Because she was part of the story. Part of the past he protected. And now, it was her turn to understand why. With renewed determination, Linda gathered the letters, tucking them carefully into her bag. Whatever this was, whatever truth lay beneath the layers of time, she would uncover it. And Leo would be right there beside her, as he always had been. The world outside the library felt different as Linda stepped into the crisp evening air, her bag heavier with the weight of forgotten stories. The letters, her grandmother's words, the secrets buried in time, pressed against her chest, whispering of a past she had never known. Leo padded beside her, his tail flicking like the hand of a clock counting down to something inevitable. The city felt alive in a way she hadn't noticed before, as if she was finally seeing beyond the surface, peeling back layers of history embedded in its very foundation. She took a deep breath. We need to go home, she murmured, but she wasn't sure if she meant her apartment or somewhere beyond it. Somewhere deeper. The ride back was quiet, save for the hum of the taxi engine. Leo sat on her lap, unusually still, his warmth seeping into her. She traced circles on the old envelope in her hands, her mind racing with thoughts she wasn't ready to voice yet. By the time she arrived at her apartment, the city's noise had dulled into the distant murmur of nightlife. She stepped inside, locking the door behind her as she placed the letters carefully on the coffee table. Leo jumped onto the couch, watching her expectantly. She hesitated. Then, with steady hands, she lit a candle on the table and sat down. The flickering light cast shadows along the walls, making the small space feel intimate, almost sacred. She unfolded the next letter and began to read aloud. To the one who finds this, know that you are never truly lost. Linda's throat tightened. The words felt like they were meant for her, across decades, across time itself. She continued reading, her voice steady but laced with emotion. There are things in this world that defy explanation, but they are no less real. Our family has been entrusted with a guardian, a watcher in the dark. He does not speak as we do, but he listens. He does not age as we do, but he remains. Linda glanced at Leo, her heart hammering. They knew about you, she whispered. Leo held her gaze, unblinking. The letter continued. If you are reading this, then the time has come for you to remember. The past is not lost. It is merely waiting to be found. The candlelight flickered, casting an eerie glow. Linda exhaled slowly. "What am I supposed to remember?" she asked, half to herself, half to Leo. For the first time, he moved. He leapt from the couch and padded toward the window, staring out into the city. And then she saw it. A reflection, faint, almost imperceptible. But it wasn't hers. It was of a woman, standing just behind her. Linda whipped around, her breath catching in her throat. But the room was empty. Only shadows remained. Her pulse pounded. She turned back to Leo, who hadn't moved. His golden eyes met hers, and in them, she saw something she had never noticed before. Recognition. Not just of her, but of who she had been. The past wasn't gone. It was calling her back. And now, she had no choice but to follow. Linda sat frozen, her heart hammering in her chest as the ghostly reflection behind her faded into the dim light of the room. It had been so faint, so fleeting, but undeniably real. She turned to Leo, her voice barely above a whisper. Who was she? Leo didn't move. He simply watched, his golden eyes filled with something that felt older than time itself. With trembling hands, Linda gathered the letters and the aged envelope, clutching them tightly as if they were the only tangible proof she had of the impossible. The weight of the past was pressing down on her, yet there was something else beneath it, a pull, an invitation. She took a deep breath. "You've been leading me to this moment, haven't you?" Leo finally moved. He padded toward the bookshelf, weaving through the shadows, and stopped in front of an old wooden chest Linda had barely noticed before. It had been sitting there for years, collecting dust. But now, it looked different. It looked, waiting. Swallowing hard, she approached and crouched before it. Her fingers hesitated over the latch before she flipped it open. Inside were books, old, worn leather-bound journals, yellowed papers with scribbled handwriting, and tucked in the very back, a small, ornate key. She picked it up, the metal cool against her palm. Her pulse quickened. A key to what? Leo let out a low, almost approving sound, then turned and walked toward the far end of the apartment. Linda followed, the air feeling heavier with each step. He stopped at a section of the wall near the old fireplace, his tail flicking once before he looked up at her expectantly. Linda's breath caught. The wall had a faint seam, so subtle she had never noticed it before. Her fingers traced the edge, and then she saw it, an old keyhole, barely visible in the dim candlelight. Hands shaking, she fit the key inside and turned it. A soft click echoed through the apartment, and then, before her eyes, the wall shifted. A hidden door creaked open, revealing a darkened passage leading downward. Linda's pulse pounded. This wasn't just a secret. This was something far greater. She turned to Leo, her voice barely above a whisper. "What's down there?" The cat simply blinked, then stepped into the passageway without hesitation. Linda hesitated only a moment longer before following him into the unknown. Linda hesitated at the entrance of the darkened passage, gripping the edges of the hidden door as if steadying herself against reality. A rush of cold air whispered from below, carrying the scent of damp stone and something older, something untouched by time. Leo had already stepped inside, his black fur barely visible against the inky darkness. He didn't look back, as if he expected her to follow. Her fingers tightened around the candle she had grabbed from the table. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward. The wooden floor of her apartment gave way to rough stone beneath her feet. The air thickened, heavy with silence, and the passage sloped downward. The deeper she went, the more distant the world above seemed, as if she was walking into another reality entirely. The candle's flickering glow illuminated the stone walls, revealing carvings, symbols etched deep into the surface. Linda paused, running her fingers over them. Some looked like constellations, others resembled animals, and then, there was one that sent a chill through her spine. A pair of golden eyes. Just like Leo's. She turned to him, her voice barely above a whisper. "You've been here before." Leo didn't answer. He simply moved ahead, his tail flicking as if urging her to continue. They reached the bottom of the passage, where a large, arched doorway stood. It was old, impossibly old, framed by more carvings and words she couldn't understand. The key she had found upstairs pulsed in her pocket, as if sensing its purpose. Swallowing hard, she withdrew it and pressed it into the rusted keyhole. The lock resisted for a moment, then gave way with a low, grinding click. The door creaked open, revealing a vast chamber beyond. Linda's breath caught. The room was filled with shelves, stretching endlessly into the shadows, each stacked with books, scrolls, and artifacts covered in dust. In the center of the chamber, a single pedestal stood, and upon it, a leather-bound book, its cover embossed with the same golden eyes she had seen carved into the stone. Her pulse pounded. Carefully, she stepped forward, her fingers hovering over the book before finally opening it. The pages were aged, fragile, yet the ink remained bold. She gasped as she read the first line. "The story of those who remember." And beneath it, her own name. The room spun. This was impossible. How could her name be in a book that looked centuries old? She turned the pages feverishly, scanning the words. They told of a lineage, a bloodline tied to something ancient, something unseen. And at the heart of it all, the Guardian. The Watcher in the dark. Leo. Linda looked at him, realization dawning in her chest like fire. He hadn't just been guiding her to this moment. He had been waiting for her to remember. Her past, her purpose, the reason why he had always been there. She wasn't just reading a story. She was part of it. And now, she had to uncover the truth before it was too late. Linda's hands trembled as she turned the pages of the ancient book. Her name stared back at her in bold ink, written among dozens, no, hundreds, of others. Some names she recognized, her mother, her grandmother, names whispered through generations. Others were unfamiliar, belonging to people lost to time. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she whispered, "What is this?" Leo leapt onto the pedestal beside her, his gaze locked onto the book as if it held the key to everything. His tail flicked once, deliberately. Linda traced the ink, the letters swirling with an eerie precision that felt too deliberate, too aware. The passage below her name read, "One who sees beyond the veil, one who remembers what others forget." Her breath hitched. This wasn't just a record of names. It was a calling. She turned another page and gasped. There, scrawled in a different, more hurried handwriting, was a message. "When the veil thins, the Guardian awakens." She looked at Leo, her voice barely above a whisper. "The Guardian. That's you, isn't it?" Leo held her gaze, unblinking. The candlelight flickered, throwing shadows across the stone walls. The chamber felt alive, as if it had been waiting for this moment. Linda's mind swirled with questions. What was the veil? Why had Leo been watching over her? And what was she supposed to remember? She turned another page. The ink was darker here, newer, as if someone had written it not centuries ago, but recently. "The time has come." A cold shiver ran down her spine. "The time for what?" she whispered. Leo suddenly tensed, his ears flattening. A low, warning growl rumbled from his throat. Linda froze. Then she heard it. A sound echoed through the passage behind her, footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Someone else was down here. The candlelight quivered as Linda's grip tightened on the book. She turned toward the arched doorway, her heart hammering in her chest. The footsteps stopped just beyond the threshold. And then, a voice. Soft, familiar. "You shouldn't have come here, Linda." Her blood ran cold. She knew that voice. And it was impossible. Linda's entire body stiffened. That voice, it was impossible. It couldn't be. She turned slowly, the candlelight trembling in her grip. The figure stood just beyond the threshold, its shape shadowed, and its presence almost ethereal. Her breath caught in her throat. "Mom." The figure took a step forward, and for a moment, the light flickered across familiar features, soft, kind eyes, the gentle curve of a knowing smile. Linda's knees nearly gave out. Her mother had passed years ago. This couldn't be real. Leo let out a low, cautious growl, his fur bristling. He stepped protectively in front of Linda, his golden eyes locked onto the figure with unwavering intensity. Linda swallowed hard, her heart racing. "This isn't real," she whispered. You're not really her." The figure's smile didn't falter, but something in its form wavered, like smoke caught in an unseen breeze. "I am a memory," it said softly. "A piece of what was left behind." Linda shook her head, backing up slightly. "Why are you here? What is this place?" The figure lifted a hand, gesturing toward the book still open on the pedestal. "You are at the crossroads, Linda. The past, the present, and what comes next all meet here." She clutched the book to her chest. "I don't understand." Her mother's voice softened. "The veil is thinning. You have always been meant to remember." A sharp gust of wind swept through the chamber, making the candle flicker wildly. Linda felt something shift, something in the air, something inside her. Her mind flooded with images, flashes of moments she didn't recognize, yet felt deep in her bones. A life before this one. A promise made long ago. She gasped, her fingers tightening around the book. But before she could finish, the figure of her mother flickered again, then began to fade. The warmth in her expression never changed. "Find the truth, Linda," she whispered. "Before it's too late." And then, she was gone. The chamber plunged into silence. Only the sound of Linda's ragged breathing remained. Leo pressed against her leg, anchoring her. She looked down at him, the weight of what just happened settling deep in her chest. "I have to know," she murmured, gripping the book tighter. "I have to find out what this means." Leo blinked once, slow and deliberate. He had always known she would. Taking a deep breath, Linda turned back to the book and flipped to the next page. And there, waiting for her, was the next clue. Linda's fingers trembled as she turned the next page of the book. The ink, though faded, carried a message that sent shivers down her spine. One who remembers the past may shape the future. Leo remained by her side, his golden eyes reflecting the candlelight as if he, too, knew what was coming. The words swirled in her mind, their weight pressing against the fragile walls of her understanding. A deep breath steadied her. She traced the next passage, her lips moving silently as she read. "There is a place where time folds, where memory lingers. The guardian remains as long as the story is unfinished. Only the chosen may set it right." Linda looked down at Leo, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is why you stayed, isn't it?" The cat blinked slowly, a silent confirmation. She pressed forward, flipping another page. And there, beneath layers of forgotten words and names, was something that stopped her heart. A drawing, hand-sketched, delicate, unmistakable. It was her. Linda, exactly as she was now, her hair curling over her shoulders, her eyes wide with knowing. The edges of the drawing were worn, as if someone had turned to this page over and over again throughout the ages. Beneath it, a final passage. "You are the last thread. The story ends with you." Her breath hitched. The weight of time itself seemed to crash down upon her. She wasn't just a bystander in this tale. She was its conclusion. The room felt smaller now, as if the walls were pressing inward, forcing her to acknowledge the truth she had been running from. Leo's presence remained steady, grounding her as she processed the impossible. A gust of wind flickered the candlelight, and suddenly, the chamber wasn't as silent as before. A voice, distant, layered with echoes, whispered in the shadows. "Remember." And just like that, memories she had never lived surged through her, glimpses of other lifetimes, moments spent in different eras, all tied to the same golden-eyed guardian who had watched over her time and time again. Tears burned in her eyes. "Leo, you've been waiting for me to see this, haven't you?" He stepped forward, pressing his warm head against her palm, his deep purr reverberating through her bones. She understood now. This was the moment of choice. Linda lifted her eyes to the book one last time, taking a deep, steadying breath. The story had led her here, to the final memory, to the truth she had spent lifetimes searching for. And now, she had to decide what happened next. Linda stood at the center of the chamber, the ancient book open in her hands, her heart pounding with the weight of the choice before her. Leo sat beside her, still and watchful, his golden eyes reflecting the candlelight. The words on the page told a story not just of the past, but of the future, her future. She could leave, return to her life above, carrying only the knowledge that she had once been part of something greater. Or she could accept her role, step fully into the legacy that had been waiting for her across lifetimes. The choice was hers. A deep breath filled her lungs. She reached out, fingers hovering over the final passage, the ink seeming to shimmer as if alive. Leo let out a low, deep purr, a sound of reassurance, of understanding. He had always known this moment would come. He had been waiting for her to remember, to choose. "I'm ready," Linda whispered. The chamber around her pulsed, the air growing warm, charged with energy. The book's pages fluttered as if stirred by an unseen force. The symbols on the walls glowed faintly, casting long shadows that twisted and shifted, forming something new. A doorway. A way forward. Linda turned to Leo, tears pricking her eyes. "You knew all along, didn't you?" Leo stepped forward, pressing his head against her leg. A wave of warmth filled her, a connection so deep it transcended words. She knelt, wrapping her arms around him. "Thank you," she whispered. "For waiting. For guiding me." The golden-eyed cat pulled back slightly, staring at her with something impossibly knowing, impossibly sad. And in that moment, she understood. His task was complete. Leo gave a slow blink, the same gesture of trust and love he had given her from the beginning. Then, with the grace he had always carried, he stepped toward the glowing doorway. And vanished. A sob caught in Linda's throat, but she didn't let it break her. Instead, she stepped forward, toward the light, toward the future waiting for her beyond. The past had found her. Now, it was time to embrace what came next. And as she crossed the threshold, she swore she felt the brush of soft fur against her hand one last time. Did this story touch your heart? Want more tales filled with mystery, emotion, and unforgettable characters? Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more captivating stories. Share your thoughts below. What was your favorite moment? And if you believe in the magic of storytelling, hit that bell icon so you never miss an adventure.